following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chuy.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Rules around RVs and tiny homes have been a hot topic of discussion around the board table at the Regional District of Nanaimo lately. Concerns were raised in May that proposed updates to a zoning bylaw could negatively impact people using RVs as permanent housing on campgrounds in various areas of the regional district. The bylaw is still under review, and while it is, enforcement on length of stay is on hold, except where there's a health, safety, or environmental concern. The issue has also prompted discussion in articles from various media outlets about RVs and tiny homes in the context of the housing crisis. At an RDN board meeting Tuesday, a motion from Director Leanne Salter called Creating a Future for Tiny Home and RV Living passed unanimously. It proposed to bring a resolution to the Union of B.C. Municipalities, calling on the body to lobby the province on a few issues related to tiny homes and RVs, including the building code. Zoe Todd spoke in support of that motion, and as we'll hear on the program today, personal circumstances have helped make her an advocate for people living in RVs and tiny homes.
My name is Zoe Todd. I'm a Red River Métis scholar working at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, and I live in the beautiful community of Beachcomber in Nanaimo Bay, and I am a tiny house dweller.
And can you walk me through what kind of changes you're hoping to see to the rules around RVs and tiny homes?
Yeah, well, they're kind of multifold. Right now, tiny homes and RVs are kind of a square peg trying to fit into the round hole of our existing governance and policies. And the strange reality is that people are living in RVs and tiny homes long term, but this is technically illegal or unpermitted according to most local governments in British Columbia, because the sticking point is RVs and tiny homes built to the RV code right now aren't considered dwellings because they don't meet the BC building code. And so until we have movement on the BC building code, which requires movement on the national building code, neither of which are getting much traction in either jurisdiction right now, local governments feel that they don't have the capacity to fully legalize living in them. But I strongly feel that the housing emergency, and I've stopped calling it a crisis and I'm calling it an emergency because the level of need and precarity that so many people in the province are experiencing really demands that the province go beyond its kind of standard approach to housing, which is currently, it has opened up some possibilities for new housing, but those are still really dependent on developers and people who have a lot of capital building those units. And the thing is that RVs and tiny homes, they're a solution that some of the most precarious people in the province have come up with ourselves. I'm not precarious, but I am living in a tiny home to help a family member ensure that they have affordable housing. And really, RVs and tiny homes are a solution that communities are coming up with to respond to the issues more nimbly and more directly than our governments have been able to. And that's why I really want to ensure that I can do whatever I can to help pressure our local governments, our provincial and federal governments to really take this seriously and remove these bureaucratic hurdles that are preventing folks from living in these units without fear of eviction due to bylaw complaints and other kind of bureaucratic processes.
On a local Regional District of Nanaimo RDN level, what are the specific things that aren't allowed right now that you would like to see be made allowed here in the RDN?
Yeah, so there's three things. The first is we really need to fully permit and recognize that people are living full-time in RVs, in parks, campgrounds, and RV resorts. And so that is something that we are getting traction on with the local government. There are significant conversations happening, recognizing that that's real, and reports have been put forward by staff that are starting to recognize this is feasible. It seems like there's movement there. The other two things that I think we're going to still get pushback on, and that's partially why I spoke today to the board, just to start normalizing this use outside of parks, campgrounds, and resorts. We really need to recognize that the parks fill up. There's such a significant demand for them now that there isn't enough spots to meet the demand and the number of people who are looking for places to park an RV and live in it. And so that means that people are living on quote unquote unsanctioned RV pads, either in the agricultural land reserve, where technically from a provincial standpoint, that's actually allowed within certain parameters. And then people are living on residential lots. And that's really normal in the US, where tiny homes have started to be permitted as sort of like, accessory dwelling units or granny suites in people's, private property. But there's still significant pushback from our local government on that because they view that as an unsafe use. And so I'm trying to advocate and point out, actually, we have all of this precedent in, other places where this has been done safely. There are certain cities and towns in BC that are allowing this with a temporary use permit in place. And what I kind of want to also advocate for is it's not good enough to have a temporary use permit, because when that runs out in 2 years or 3 years or 6 years, I don't think that we're going to have enough housing in place to meet the continuing demand. So we need to figure out how to do this in a more longer term way, while ensuring safety of the people living in the homes and ensuring that communities, are on board with a way of doing this that, sort of supports all of our health, safety, and environmental needs and desires.
Where exactly, what maybe kinds of land or types of living situations would you like people with RVs or tiny homes to be able to set things up within the RDN on?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So I think, we have a diverse and dynamic community, and that means that every family and household has diverse and dynamic needs. And, sort of the traditional housing that's been common in this region has been single family homes. But we see with the cost of living crisis, in addition to the housing emergency, people are actually having to buy properties together as a family, or also with the aging, sort of the realities of the aging portion of our community. People have, very specific care needs, or just, a desire for community and sort of support from family members or loved ones or friends. And so I would love to see an acknowledgement that RVs and tiny homes can be a form of what I'm calling flexible density, which means that you don't need to completely rezone your property and build a permanent, suite on blocks or on foundation to have that capacity to have a family member come and stay with you for a few years while you need support. It's also significantly cheaper to move an RV or a tiny home onto a property to create that kind of sense of community and support. It's way cheaper to buy an RV than to even begin to build even a small detached house on foundation. So yeah, those are some of the things I would love to see our local government be a bit more open to, and kind of recognize that there is this need for more flexibility, more diversity in how we think about what a family living looks like, and to move beyond this idea that RVs only belong, in a park or a campground. They actually can play a really dynamic role in other contexts. And in fact, if you look at the rental listings and the realty listings, people already have unsanctioned RV pads all over the region. It's a selling point for a lot of properties here to sort of say full hookups, RV pad, in addition to XYZ aspects of the listing. So I kind of also would like our local government to just catch up to what's actually happening. And Director Leanne Salter has been a really strong advocate for that. She's used, really evocative language like the horses already left the barn on this. People are living in these units in ways beyond, you might be imagining. We need to meet people where they're at is sort of the message she's been getting across. And that's been so powerful.
How do you think maybe taxation or property taxation, or even, I wonder if people would bring concerns about the impact of allowing this on property values. What would you say to those?
Yeah. So those are two of the sort of silent issues that don't get talked about. I think safety and environmental impact, which of course we need to keep in mind. We want to make sure people are safe. We want to make sure they have the right hookups so that they're safe and the land around them and the people around them are safe. But I think that sometimes those concerns and the concern about the building code get used as a proxy to avoid the more uncomfortable conversation that people with more money and who own property don't like the idea of these units being around them because it quote unquote lowers their property value. And then they sort of also have this argument that people living in these units are using their unfair share of resources. And there's really good responses to that to help dispel some of those myths. In terms of taxation, we actually already have models for how to figure out how to assess the value that a unit like this might be adding to a property. So in the meeting today, I pointed out to research that City Planner Blaine Russell has done on this topic. And he pointed out, well, we can just look to the Manufactured Home Tax Act, which gives us tools for how to assess taxes on a movable home. And then the property value thing, I mean, if we look at the current distribution of quote unquote unsanctioned RVs being used as dwellings throughout the region, we look at the immense increase in property value that has happened since 2020 here. Like I believe a single family home in my region was around $650,000 in 2020 and now is at around $8,999. And so like the argument that it lowers property values doesn't hold water when you look at the fact that people are already living in them and property values have gone up immensely, and it has not hurt people to have these in their area. In fact, in my neighborhood, there are a number of folks living quietly in RVs that I'm not going to point out where, but you know, it's obviously not impacting property values here, which are quite high.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHOI's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at choi.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
We're talking RVs and tiny homes on the program today. Zoe Todd has been advocating for changes to make it easier for people to live legally in those forms of housing. She spoke to the issue at an RDN meeting this Tuesday, and she's speaking with me on the program today. Can you tell me how you came into doing this advocacy work?
Yeah, so until a few months ago, I was just one of those folks living quietly in a quote unquote, non-compliant house. But I was living in a different regional, part of the RDN. I was living in Area F in the town of Arrington. And I thought I understood kind of the policies in place, and given just the sheer amount of people in that town who were living in RVs and tiny homes, and the way that I had interpreted the bylaws as I was reading them as a layperson, I was under the impression that they just counted as a secondary suite, and that my understanding was our property was zoned that way. So I bought one because it was an opportunity to live with family and to stop renting, and to get, have something of my own to live in. And I'd had a very years long dream of living in a tiny house, over a decade of sort of just thinking, this is actually how I want to live. This really resonates with my values. And, and so I bought one, and I moved it into my family's property and rented a space from them, and I lived in it from June of 2023 until March of 2024 without incident. And I was in a really central part of Arrington, easily hundreds of people drove by my house every day, and no one ever complained. No one ever took any sort of concern forward to the regional government. In fact, all we got were like positive comments, like, oh, that's really cute. I think I want one. We are looking for an affordable way to help some family out. But we moved to a new part of the RDN in March. And basically, the day we moved into our property, an action was commenced against us that resulted in a bylaw enforcement process against me, arguing that I was living in an illegal dwelling and that I had 90 days to get it off my property. And so then, receiving that bylaw enforcement communication from my local government really spurred me to sort of really make sure I understood, well, what are the actual federal, provincial, and local statutes and policies that actually apply to living in tiny homes. And that also brought me into conversation with people who are living in quote unquote non-compliant housing throughout the region, who are really struggling and have found they aren't getting the support from the local government that they need in this emergency. And that really spurred me to sort of take the fact that I have been sort of outed as someone who's living in a dwelling that the local government is struggling to figure out how to regulate. And I felt that I really had a responsibility, especially because like as an employed, tenured academic, I have the time, energy, and resources to do that digging. And folks who are struggling with like various other sort of challenges in the cost of living crisis and the housing emergency don't necessarily have the amount of time to dedicate to just like, going through every single statute I could find. And I just felt really motivated. And as people shared more and more their stories with me, I felt that I really had a responsibility now that I had been outed by my local government, that I really had a responsibility to help advocate for folks who are living in these units out of necessity and need support, not by law enforcement.
Has that situation where you were told to move this off the property within 90 days, has that resolved yet? I would say it's still in process, but we have received, sort of some hopeful insights through conversation with the local government that, I think that the fact that the enforcement against myself and my family was happening at the same time that a proposal was being considered by the local government to change kind of some of its approach to RV living, in that they wanted to codify and kind of clarify that you are absolutely under no circumstances allowed to live in an RV full-time at all in the region. And they were trying to kind of put that through in a bylaw review update that they've been undertaking for the last 4 years. And that received a lot of pushback from the community. And that also has shifted some of the conversation in that way at this, so those were happening at the same time. And in that sort of set of conversations, it was clarified to us that there is technically possibly a temporary permitting process that we could pursue. My hope is that, if motions like Director Salter's motion today to get the province to finally create a tiny house code in the building code, we can move past this idea that this is just a temporary solution and actually start thinking about what does a long-term tiny house strategy look like for British Columbia, and what does it look like for our local government. And then also, I just think it's really important that like the tiny house community doesn't abandon the RV community, because sometimes tiny houses can be seen as like slightly more acceptable because they look more like a house and they won't lower someone's property value because they look so cute, etc. But the reality is that tiny homes and RVs are linked, and we have to make sure we're fighting for housing affordability for everyone. And for a lot of folks, that looks like living in an RV. And so I feel a responsibility to make sure that I'm advocating for both in the work that I'm doing. You mentioned that since you've started doing some of this advocacy work, you've been connecting with people, you've been hearing their stories. What are some of the stories that have stuck with you the most?
One story I heard recently was that like what affordable housing looks like right now in the region is, for some people, that means renting a shared room with a stranger for a few $100 a month. And in that context, like I really start to think about okay, why are we fetishizing this idea of a house on foundation as the safest and only form of house that someone can live in, when we could be in a, in a thoughtful way, regulating and creating possibilities for folks to have the dignity of their own living space in a trailer or RV or tiny house. So that one really, sticks with me as sort of like the idea of like, we're at the point where people are having to rent shared rooms in the region, and then just stories of folks who, they're dealing with so many challenges due to the housing crisis, due to the cost of living crisis, that a call from bylaw from a neighbor or someone who just doesn't like the look of an RV being nearby, it can have all of these devastating knock-on effects for that person's ability to access the community and the resources they need. And so those are sort of like, so those are just some examples that kind of stand out in my mind of like, I don't think that sometimes people who make these bylaw complaints understand just how precarious folks are living and what a devastating impact it can have on someone's capacity to live, to escalate something to the local government when we should be working together as a community to make sure everyone has what they need.
Is the situation different depending? You've talked about how before you were in Arrington. Does it matter from a legal standpoint, whether you're on Gabriola Island or in Arrington or in Noose, or is it really just does it really just come down to whether your neighbors complain?
It's a bit of both. Like in Arrington, in Area F, like it's been made pretty clear that enforcement isn't really happening. Like people, it just, Director Salter has made that clear in her public communications, her sort of like conversations with media and in meetings with the local government. She's articulated like, look, people aren't enforcing here. And so, and the wording, Area F falls under a separate set of bylaws, zoning bylaws from the rest of the region. So if you actually look at their bylaws, they don't define recreational vehicle as a temporary use. It just says this is XYZ, but the word like seasonal, temporary doesn't show up in its definition, which is different from the zoning that applies in the rest of the region. And as far as I understand, in Gabriola in 2022, they put a suspension in place on any kind of bylaw enforcement against non-compliant housing, just to recognize the sheer need for housing in this moment. And then for the rest of the region is like, what I'm learning is it really does come down to whether someone complains. And I think there's useful things to take from the secondary suites policy that the RDN itself has referenced in trying to respond to kind of some of the issues that have been raised around this issue in the last few months. And they do point out in their secondary suites policy, they outline that they are not actively seeking out non-compliant housing. They're only enforcing if a complaint comes in, and they say in there that they are prioritized, like they will enforce if the complaint highlights an impact on an adjacent property. So, there are at least, in theory, some constraints that are supposed to be in place that recognize that, secondary suites, in whatever form they seem to take, they do add to the housing affordability of our region. But I think the question is, do we know that the RDN is following the letter of its own policies? And I think that's something for the public to kind of like really ask questions about. Of course, we want our local government to be as accountable as possible, and you hope that they're following the policies as closely as possible. And I think that's where the secondary suites policy is really interesting to look at in terms of guidance on how the RDN could move forward on this question.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to this conversation today?
I just, I want to express gratitude because there has been such robust conversation about this issue in the last few months, and that ties into much longer conversations that have been happening in the region about housing affordability and also just the feasibility and viability of using, quote unquote, non-conforming or, novel approaches to addressing the struggles that many are facing in this housing emergency. And I do want to sort of express gratitude that many members of our local government have been open to conversation, and that there have been folks like Director Salter and also Director Leanne Wallace has done some really important advocacy work on behalf of folks in her region who are living in RV resorts, which was a category which almost got removed from the bylaw review, and now it looks like it will get put back in. And so I think I really want to credit those members of the RDN who are maintaining an open mind about this. And Director Vanessa Craig has also done advocacy on this topic in the past. So just want to sort of credit the folks who are trying to think creatively, and just also acknowledging how serious this housing emergency is and the need for us to push and change and innovate and find creative ways to help people have that sense of security and dignity in their housing.
Zoe Todd is a tiny home dweller who lives in Nanoose Bay. She's also an associate professor at Simon Fraser University and a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Governance and Freshwater Fish Futures. You can read more about her personal housing situation in a June 17th article published online in The Discourse, written by Julie Chadwick. That article is titled Tiny Homes and RVs Help Ease the Housing Crisis. So why is the Regional District of Nanaimo cracking down on them? That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.
So you spoke there about some of the maybe different interactions between rules and laws at the federal, the provincial, and the local level between RVs and tiny homes. Can you tell me maybe about at the community level in British Columbia, have there been different responses in different places that you can share?
Yeah. So, each regional district and municipality is kind of approaching this issue in their own way. And that's where it's kind of exciting to look at what's happening each place, because that's where precedents are getting set. And then we can look and say, oh, okay, this city had to do this in response to legal action from someone they tried to evict. And now that means that's possible. And so, a really prominent case that happened at the end of 2023 or came to a head in the end of 2023 was a couple who were living out of necessity in an RV on their parents' agricultural land reserve farm land in Vernon. They had a bylaw complaint taken out against them, and they were facing significant bylaw action from the city of Vernon telling them they couldn't live in it. But they really brilliantly pushed back and pointed out, actually, at the provincial level, the Agricultural Land Commission recognizes vehicles as a permitted, a prescribed residential structure. And they, did an amazing, just an amazing service to people living in RVs in the province, because they actually held the city accountable. And that city has now had to update its approach to the bylaw enforcement of RVs on the agricultural land reserve throughout the province. And that now means that there's a precedent acknowledging that you can live in an RV on farmland under, of course, the conditions of the Agricultural Land Commission, which, has its own kind of things in place to protect farmland. But that was a really big win. And then there have been a number of cases in Surrey where a really important anti-poverty activist and lawyer, Paula Gase, has been representing people who've been under threat of eviction from RV parks. And that has, sort of manifested in precedents being set that acknowledge, again, that RVs actually count as permanent residences under some applications of the Manufactured Home Park Tenancy Act. And so that also sets the precedent that, actually RVs can be housing. And in fact, they make sense as housing in a housing emergency like this. And so there's just it's kind of incremental, but it feels like it's starting to pick up pace. Just, I think, due to the fact that so many people are turning to RVs and tiny home RVs and other sort of quote unquote non-compliant housing to get through this emergency. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I think that there have been some really important precedents set in different parts of the province that are helping. And then here in the Regional District of Nanaimo, there's a really significant debate happening over whether, the RDN, as we call it colloquially, whether it should quote unquote, allow people to live full time in RVs. And the community has been pretty vocal in saying, yes, the emergency is so bad that we do need to allow this. And in fact, of all the places that this makes sense in the province, in this part of the province where the climate is relatively mild, this makes a lot of sense. And people have been doing this actually for years, if not decades. We do have the capacity to do this. And
can you tell me maybe on a